You know what's interesting? The moment an empath finally stops explaining themselves, stops chasing and goes quiet, that silence is louder than any words they could have spoken. And the person who once pulled away, the avoidant, suddenly finds themselves in the very place they thought they wanted distance. But that distance isn't peaceful. It's terrifying, because the silence of an empath is not absence, it's power. Let me tell you why this happens. For so long, the empath is the one holding the emotional weight of the relationship. They apologize first. They explain. They reach out when things feel cold. They become the glue. And the avoidant learns, consciously or unconsciously, that the empath will always come back, no matter how far they pull away. But here's the twist. When the empath finally realizes their worth and chooses silence, not out of punishment, but out of self-respect, that dynamic flips. The avoidant, who once ran from intimacy, suddenly finds themselves haunted by the very thing they thought they wanted: space. Only this time, it's not comforting space. It's empty. It's final. That silence becomes a mirror. It forces the avoidant to see what they've lost, what they've taken for granted, and what will not be waiting for them forever. When an empath goes quiet, it's not because they've run out of things to say. It's because they've finally realized that speaking has been costing them more than it's been giving back. Think about how often an empath finds themselves explaining, clarifying, justifying. They'll bend over backwards to make sure the other person understands their heart, their intentions, their love. They'll write the long text. They'll pick up the phone even after being ignored. They'll stay up late at night thinking of ways to smooth things over. And at first, it looks like kindness. It looks like devotion. But over time, it starts to feel like pleading, like proving, like begging someone to see their value. That's where the silence begins. Silence isn't the absence of love. It's the presence of self-respect. For the empath, breaking the habit of over-explaining is terrifying because they've built their identity on being understood, on being the safe place. But the moment they stop, something powerful shifts. Their silence says what their words never could: I know my worth. I don't have to convince you to see it. That is where strength begins to show itself, not through loud declarations, but through the restraint of not needing to fill the air with justification. You see, silence is misinterpreted all the time. The avoidant might think they're pulling away. Maybe they're weak. Maybe they don't care. But the truth is, silence from an empath is the hardest choice they can make. It's a decision to stop over-functioning in a relationship that has been running on their emotional labor. And that quiet communicates something unmistakable: the dynamic has changed. The rules of engagement are no longer the same. What's fascinating is how silence carries more impact than words, precisely because it leaves space. Space for the avoidant to feel the absence of what they've been taking for granted. Space for them to notice that the apologies, the check-ins, the reassurances have stopped. Space for them to finally sit with the discomfort they've been avoiding. And in that space, the silence screams. It says, I will not keep chasing. I will not keep justifying. I will not keep giving you more than you are willing to give back. For the empath, learning that silence is strength isn't about manipulation. It's not a game of withholding or punishing. It's about realizing that every unnecessary word, every repeated explanation, every desperate attempt to be understood was chipping away at their own peace. Silence is their way of reclaiming that peace. It's the moment they step back and say, if you care, you'll meet me here. And if you don't, I'll be fine without you. The power of silence is that it removes all illusions. It's no longer about who can argue better, who can justify more, or who can keep the connection alive at all costs. It's about presence versus absence, effort versus neglect. And in that moment, the empath, without saying a word, proves that their strength was never in how much they gave, but in knowing when to stop giving. The avoidant feels safest when there's distance. In the beginning, that space feels like freedom. They convince themselves they need it to breathe, to protect their independence, to avoid being swallowed by someone else's emotions. And as long as the empath keeps leaning in, closing that gap, reaching across the distance, the avoidant can maintain the illusion that they're in control. They can retreat, knowing that when they're ready, the empath will be right there to bridge the divide. This dynamic gives them the comfort of space without ever truly losing connection. But what happens when that pursuit vanishes? That's when everything begins to unravel. At first, the avoidant might not notice. They assume the empath will always play the same role, the same way a person expects the sun to rise each morning. They've grown accustomed to the text messages that come after a fight, the gentle reassurances after silence, the endless attempts to reconnect. But when the empath decides to stop chasing, when their silence takes the place of explanations and their presence is no longer guaranteed, the avoidance world shifts in an unsettling way. Suddenly, the distance that once felt safe turns into a void. It's no longer space to breathe. It's space that echoes with the reality of what's missing. The avoidant thrives on pursuit because pursuit reassures them. Even if they're pulling away, the fact that someone is chasing confirms their worth. It validates that they're wanted, that they're significant enough for someone to fight for. That pursuit allows them to keep retreating without ever facing the possibility of abandonment, because the empath's energy fills the gap. But when that energy disappears, the avoidant is left staring at silence. And that silence doesn't feel like peace. It feels like rejection. It feels like abandonment. It feels like the nightmare they've been running from all along. This is where the irony reveals itself. The avoidant runs from intimacy to protect themselves from pain, yet it's the absence of intimacy that hurts them the most. They don't realize it until the pursuit is gone. Their fear of being consumed blinds them to the fact that they were never in danger of being swallowed by the empath. What they were in danger of was losing someone who carried the emotional weight of the relationship, someone who made sure the connection never collapsed. And when that person goes quiet, the avoidant has to face something they've avoided their whole lives: responsibility for the relationship. Without pursuit, the avoidant feels the fragility of what they thought was secure. They can no longer take for granted that love will always be there. They can no longer rely on the empath to do the work of holding things together. They are confronted with a silence that demands action. For some, it becomes the wake-up call that forces them to step forward. For others, it becomes the haunting realization that they've lost something they assumed would never leave. In both cases, the pursuit they once resisted reveals itself as the very thing that kept them safe, and its disappearance is the very thing that shakes their world. For as long as the empath has been in the relationship, they've been the one carrying the emotional labor. They're the ones noticing when something feels off, when the avoidant grows distant, when the energy shifts. They take it upon themselves to fix it, to soothe, to repair. They write the long messages. They ask the hard questions. They take responsibility for problems that aren't even theirs. And in doing so, they create a dynamic where the avoidant doesn't have to show up emotionally. The empath is holding both ends of the rope, keeping the connection alive even when the other person has let go. But when the empath chooses silence, when they stop doing all the explaining, all the chasing, all the heavy lifting, the emotional labor shifts. Suddenly, the avoidant is left with the weight they've been shielded from all along. They're faced with the silence that used to be filled with effort and words, and that silence is heavy. It demands something of them. It demands accountability, presence, vulnerability. The very things they've been avoiding. This is often the first time the avoidant truly feels the cost of their withdrawal. As long as the empath was over-functioning, they could get away with under-functioning. They could remain distant, detached, self-protective because someone else was holding the emotional structure together. But without the empath doing the work, the structure collapses. The conversations don't happen. The reconnections don't take place. The relationship doesn't move forward, and the avoidant starts to feel the consequences of their passivity in a way they never had to before. It's not that the empath's silence is cruel, it's that it finally restores balance. For the first time, the avoidant feels what it's like when their lack of effort is not covered by someone else's persistence. The emotional imbalance becomes painfully clear, and the avoidant is left with a choice: step into the labor they've been avoiding or watch the connection dissolve. What makes this shift so powerful is that it exposes the truth. When the empath stops doing all the emotional work, the relationship is no longer being propped up by one person's endless giving. The avoidant can no longer hide behind the illusion that things are fine just because the empath keeps fixing them. The silence strips away that illusion and forces reality into focus. For the empath, this moment is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because they're no longer draining themselves to hold something together. Terrifying because it means releasing control and allowing the avoidant to either rise to the occasion or let the relationship fall apart. But in that release lies the truth of the connection. If the avoidant cares, they'll step forward. If they don't, the silence will make it clear. Either way, the weight finally shifts back to where it belongs, and the empath is no longer carrying more than their share. Clarity has a way of emerging in silence that words can never achieve. When the empath is speaking, explaining, reassuring, and filling the space, the avoidant is free to remain distracted. They don't have to confront their own feelings because the empath's voice is louder than their own internal dialogue. But when the empath withdraws into silence, all of that noise disappears and what's left is a mirror. Suddenly, the avoidant has no one to hide behind, no constant reassurance to lean on, no comforting buffer between them and their own emotions. The quiet becomes confronting. It forces them to notice what they feel or don't feel about the person who is no longer doing all the work. That absence becomes a test. Without the empath's constant presence, the avoidant is left to ask themselves, do I actually care about this relationship? Or was I just comfortable being cared for? This is where silence becomes the ultimate filter. It strips away the illusion that things are okay simply because someone is keeping them alive. In the absence of that effort, the truth of the avoidant's desire or lack of it comes into focus. If they miss the empath, if they feel the sting of the void, that awareness tells them something undeniable. There was more value in the connection than they were willing to admit. For the empath, the silence also creates clarity. By stepping back and no longer pushing for connection, they get to see what the avoidant does with the space. Do they step forward or do they disappear into it? The answer tells the empath everything they need to know without another argument, without another late night conversation, without another plea to just talk about it. The behavior in silence reveals the truth more than words ever could. Clarity in this dynamic isn't always comfortable, but it is always necessary. The avoidant often believes they crave distance, but when given that distance without pursuit, they discover whether it's really what they want, or whether intimacy was what they feared but secretly needed. The silence puts them in direct contact with their discomfort. It forces them to reflect on why they pull away, what they're afraid of, and whether the person they've been pushing away is someone they're willing to lose. And for the empath, the clarity is equally powerful. They no longer have to guess about where they stand. They no longer have to exhaust themselves with questions that never get answered. They can observe, they can witness the truth that unfolds when they stop filling the silence with effort. The avoidance actions, or lack of them, become the answer, and in that truth, even if it's painful, there is peace. Because clarity ends confusion. It shows both people what's real, what's missing, and whether there's something worth rebuilding or something that has already run its course. When the empath goes silent, it's easy for an outsider to assume it's about punishment, like they're withholding love to teach the avoidant a lesson. But that's not the reality at all. The silence isn't born from revenge, it's born from exhaustion and finally choosing release over resistance. For so long, the empath has been caught in the cycle of chasing, explaining, and proving. They've spent endless energy trying to make the relationship work, trying to bridge the distance, trying to love someone into safety. But eventually, there comes a moment when they realize that their effort has turned into a one-sided performance. That's when silence becomes not a weapon, but a doorway out of chaos. Release is very different from revenge. Revenge is about control. It's about getting the other person to feel the pain you felt. Release is about letting go of control altogether. It's about saying, I no longer need to convince you. I no longer need to fight to be seen. I no longer need to keep carrying this. The empath's silence communicates this shift more powerfully than words ever could. It's a calm, grounded kind of withdrawal. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady and final. This release changes the entire energy of the dynamic. The avoidant, who has grown accustomed to the empath being the safety net, suddenly realizes that net is no longer there. But the empath isn't sitting in silence waiting for the avoidant to panic and come back. They're sitting in silence because they've finally accepted that their peace matters more than constant pursuit. They've chosen themselves. And that choice is not about inflicting pain on the avoidant. It's about ending the pain they've been putting themselves through. What's powerful about this kind of silence is that it carries dignity. It's not fueled by anger or desperation. It's fueled by self-respect. The empath isn't slamming doors or shouting ultimatums. They're simply no longer participating in a dynamic that drains them. Their silence says, I release you to be who you are, and I release myself from trying to change it. That release is often the most terrifying thing for the avoidant, because it means they are left to face themselves without the empath's constant cushioning. For the empath, this silence is a reclamation of power. Not power over the avoidant, but power over their own life, their own energy, their own heart. It's a recognition that love should not be a constant uphill battle, and that someone who truly values the connection will show it without being pushed. By going silent, they step out of the exhausting cycle of proving and chasing and step into a state of peace that cannot be taken from them. It's not about closing the door with bitterness. It's about leaving it behind with grace. And in that grace, the empath discovers that silence isn't empty at all. It's full of freedom, self-respect, and the calm certainty that they no longer need to fight for what should flow naturally. So, when you really think about it, the silence of the empath is not about coldness. It's not about punishment. It's about awakening. It's the moment they stop pouring from an empty cup and allow the avoidant to feel the very absence they once took for granted. That silence isn't a wall. It's a mirror. It reflects back to the avoidant the truth of their own choices. And sometimes that silence becomes the loudest message of all. If you value this, step up. If you don't, I'll be okay without you. And that's the real power here. When silence enters, everything hidden becomes clear. The empath learns their worth doesn't live in chasing, and the avoidant learns that distance doesn't feel so safe when no one is waiting on the other side of it. Silence changes the game, not by force, but by truth. So my challenge to you is this: if you've been over-explaining, over-giving, over-carrying, consider the strength in stepping back. Let your silence speak. And if you're someone who's been pulling away, notice the moment the noise stops, because that quiet might just be your last chance to choose differently. Thank you for giving me your time and energy today. I hope this message resonates with you, not just in your relationships with others, but in your relationship with yourself. Because the most important connection you'll ever protect is the one you have with your own peace. Take care of yourselves, take care of your hearts, and until next time, thank you.